Great. Well, again, thank you all for attending the webinar on cosmetic safety hosted by Women's Voices for the Earth and Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. Just a little background on our organizations. Women's Voices for the Earth is a national women's health organization that amplifies women's voices to eliminate the toxic chemicals that harm our health and communities. We have three main program areas where we work to reduce the use of harmful chemicals and advocate for more ingredient disclosure. And those areas are cleaning products, feminine care products like tampons and pads, but also douches, washes, and sprays and wipes, and cosmetics and salon products. Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, or BCPP, works to prevent breast cancer by eliminating our exposure to toxic chemicals and radiation linked to the disease. The Campaign for Safe Cosmetics is a project of the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. On today's webinar, Alexandra Scranton, who's our Director of Science and Research at Women's Voices for the Earth and the author of the report, Cosmetic Ingredient Review, Failing the Public, Failing Manufacturers, will discuss the findings of the report and why the CIR cannot be trusted to protect our health from harmful ingredients in cosmetics and personal care products. Also on the webinar, Janet Nudelman, who is the Director of Program and Policy at Breast Cancer Prevention Partners and the Director of the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, will provide the latest update on what's happening with cosmetic safety legislation on the state and federal level. So at the end of the webinar, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So Alex is going to start us off, and then when her presentation is done, we'll move over to Janet. So thank you, Alex.
All right, thanks. Go to my first slide.
Oh, yeah, we'll just click it on the mouse.
There we go. All righty. So thanks, everybody. We're excited. There's great enthusiasm for the call. We're happy to have everybody on. So what am I going to be talking about today? I'm talking about this report that we just released. That's really a product of about a decade of watchdogging of the Cosmetic Ingredient Review that I've done for Women's Voices, kind of on a ad hoc basis. Fortunately, the CIR has a fairly transparent process, so I've read a lot of their transcripts. I've watched how their safety assessments have evolved over time, and I've become familiar with how they work, kind of who the personalities are, and we really felt this was the right time to kind of tell an alternative story about the CIR. So let's start first with who the CIR is. For those who might not be familiar. Now, the CIR, the Cosmetic Ingredient Review, is a program of the Personal Care Products Council, founded in 1976. The PCPC, Personal Care Products Council, it's the major trade organization which represents over 600 cosmetic product manufacturers. And so they created the CIR, whose purpose is to determine those cosmetic ingredients for which there's a reasonable certainty in the judgment of competent scientists that the ingredient is safe under its conditions of use. So they were created basically as a self-regulatory body, given the lack of any government agency doing this work to substantiate the safety of cosmetic ingredients. And they were meant to help manufacturers with this, truly complex work of safety substantiation. And they also serve as kind of the backup for the industry when they make claims of, safe products and safe ingredients. They have this, supposedly independent process which helps them back that up. So the CIR, it's actually a fairly large effort. They've got a steering committee. They have a staff of about 12 people who are, writers and support staff and scientists. There's the CIR Science and Support Committee. That's a committee of industry scientists who provide their input to the staff. And then there's the CIR Expert Panel, which is the most transparent part. It's the panel of independent scientists, dermatologists, toxicologists, physicians, all of whom contribute to these published safety assessments of cosmetic ingredients that they do. All of the management and staffing and the meetings, et cetera, the honorariums for the expert panel, that is all paid for and managed by the Personal Care Products Council, which is then funded by dues-paying cosmetic manufacturers. So what the CIR does is they do review cosmetic ingredients. They don't specifically review products, but they're just reviewing the ingredients those products are made of. They collect and curate the available science, and then the staff writes a draft safety assessment, which is then reviewed and discussed by the expert panel. After they've done this, it kind of goes back to the staff. They come up with a final assessment, which gets approved, and then it gets published in a peer-reviewed journal called the International Journal of Toxicology. And they sponsor a supplement usually twice a year in which these journal papers are published. And over the years, they've assessed the safety of hundreds of these cosmetic ingredients. So the question can be asked, why are we writing this report now? That this has been in process for since '76, and we've been watching it for a long time. Well, there is federal safe cosmetics legislation in play that Janet's going to talk about a little bit later that will require some sort of safety substantiation of cosmetic ingredients, both on the part of FDA and on the part of manufacturers. And there's been some interest in, various earlier drafts, and that we've, heard at congressional hearings and things, of codifying the CIR as a regulatory authority. So making them and their decisions kind of official safety substantiation, and putting that into law. Right now, the decisions of the CIR are, it's entirely voluntary as to whether or not you want to pay any attention to them. The companies who are members of the PCPC are supposed to adhere to them. There's still a lot of, wiggle room there, and of course there's not really any enforcement that anyone is required to adhere to their decisions. There's also been a number of efforts by the CIR in recent years to promote their own work, to promote their structure. They've been kind of doing these global tours, talking to other countries, trying to get them to set up their own, similar CIRs. They've written journal papers. They've talked at a lot of conferences. So there kind of seems to be a greater effort to promote their work, and we thought there really was an alternative story to be told about how they actually operate. Because when you hear them tell their story, it does actually sound fairly convincing that they're doing this, scientifically robust work, and the reality is that they're not actually. They are, in fact, failing the public and failing manufacturers as well. So our report is broken down into 4 main failings of the CIR. There are so many more than these that I have found over the years, but these were kind of 4 main ones that we've seen come up time and time again that are fairly easy to explain. So we've got conflict of interest. They operate on a very narrow scope that excludes concerns for workers in the environment. They make very overly broad conclusions on inhalation hazards, and then there's a really inadequate assessment of data gaps. And so I'll go through each of these with examples of specific ingredients and the safety assessments that they've done for those ingredients, which demonstrate these various failings over the years. So we'll start with the first one. Here we go. All right, start with the first one, which is conflict of interest. And this is really the big one that underlies everything else that they do and really affects everything else they do. There's inherent conflict of interest that exists between the role of the CIR and that of the PCPC and the cosmetic manufacturers that they represent. These manufacturers, and I've got a couple examples on the side here of some of the big ones, but there are about 600 of them. The manufacturers have a financial interest in safety assessments that confirm the safety of the ingredients they already use, right? They want safety assessments that say that their products are safe. They don't want to reformulate because it's very expensive. They don't want to be liable to, for lawsuits for unsafe ingredients. Equally, they have a real financial disinterest in any kind of public pronouncement that the ingredients that they use are not safe. Again, this brings on potential lawsuits, the need for reformulation, et cetera. And these companies are they're the dues-paying, financial backing for the Personal Care Products Council, which is then the financial backing for the CIR. So this conflict is it's there. You see it throughout their work that there is a bias where greater consideration of the company's bottom lines is taken over that of public health. Okay, so one of the best examples of this over the years is talc. Talc has been controversial since the 1970s when the first data was coming out of people having respiratory effects There was associations with mesothelioma, potentially lung cancer, and then risks of ovarian cancer, particularly from cosmetic uses like perineal powder application. So this started coming out, the science started coming out. There started to be a couple lawsuits and concerns. And at the time, the PCPC, with largely backing from Johnson & Johnson, who's the major manufacturer of talc at the time, or talc cosmetic products, began actively defending the safety of talc and manufacturing doubt on the harms that talc might be associated with disease. And they hired, numerous consultants and scientists to generate science. They raised a lot of doubt in a number of public forums. So where was the CIR in all of this when all of this was started? They did exist in 1976. Amazingly, they did not take up a review of the safety of talc until 2012, which is when they did it for the first time. So they basically stayed out of it, even though it was a highly controversial public issue of cosmetic ingredients causing health problems. They just didn't touch it, which I think, I think there were definite reasons why they were staying out of this argument. But once they did start reviewing it in 2012, the transcripts are available of their conversations. Their conversations were incredibly short. They did not have a lot to say. They were all sure, that talc was going to come out as, safe as used. The background, of course, to this 2012 deliberations is that Johnson & Johnson was being sued in a major way. There was a number of major class action lawsuits, hundreds of millions of dollars on the line, where a negative review from the CIR would have meant serious dollars in these lawsuits. So that's kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room they weren't mentioning. There was really no way they could make any other decision other than that talc was safe as used. I've got one quote here that came from one of the transcripts of their meetings. I mean, particularly with ovarian cancer, there is a tremendous amount of research on ovarian cancer and talc. It doesn't all go the same direction. There are some conflicting studies, but there's certainly a lot to talk about. But the discussion was along the lines of, there aren't really any studies. I don't think there's a causative relationship. I don't have any concerns about this. And then Dr. Shank says, well, if it did possibly cause, cancer of the ovary, how come we're not seeing it cause cancer of the cervix or cancer of the uterus? Because anything that causes ovarian cancer also causes cervical cancer and uterine cancer, which of course is not true. Like these things these things can have different causes. Things that cause breast cancer don't cause liver cancer or kidney cancer, and no one's ever making these connections. It's just not, a scientific point. But this is kind of the level of conversation they were having around this important ingredient, which millions of people have been exposed to and continue to be exposed to over the years. Okay. Next example is preservatives. This one comes up a lot as well. Recent scientists is finding more and more examples of harmful exposures to common preservatives in cosmetics. Preservatives are certainly important. We don't want bacteria growing in these products. We want longer shelf lives. But the chemicals we're using to preserve products are proving more and more to be harmful. So things like parabens, formaldehyde releasers, MI, methyl isocyanidone, is linked to numerous allergic reactions, and there have been restrictions in other countries on a lot of these chemicals because of these harms. So industry is under pressure to find safer preservatives. At the same time, reformulation is difficult and expensive. Over the years, the CIR has really made a concerted effort to keep these existing preservatives on the market despite evidence of harm. So our report goes through a number, again, quotes from the transcripts. I've got one example here where they were talking just last June about polyaminopropyl biguanide. This is a preservative that actually killed hundreds of people in South Korea when it was included in a disinfectant used in humidifiers. They were discussing its safety. They knew it was a problem, but they're very concerned about seeing this preservative lost when so many other preservatives are being lost. I mean, that's, they're really putting this concern about not having preservatives on the market over the concern of public health, which is really what their job is supposed to be. So preservatives have come up over and over as being something that is safe despite evidence of harm. Okay, let's move on. the second failing of the CIR. The second failing is this narrow scope, which excludes concerns for workers and the environment. The CIR safety assessments, they generally come to some sort of conclusion along the lines, the language they often use is safe as used in cosmetics, which really implies kind of safety across the board, but it's very misleading because they're really only talking safety in a very narrow context. The CIR is only concerned about safety to human health from a consumer's use of cosmetics. So if a cosmetic ingredient is known to harm waterways, if it affects the environment, if it causes endocrine disruption in wildlife, if it causes harm to salon workers, it may well be ruled as safe in cosmetics by the CIR because they limit their scope to be able to ignore these other factors, which are presumably of concern both to public health and to manufacturers as well. So the example of occupational hazards, and again, there are so many, they do occasionally discuss occupational hazards, but in a really haphazard way. But phthalates are one example. When they reviewed phthalates, there was, a fair amount of data, showing harm. So it's unusual for them. What they did in this case was they calculated a margin of safety. So they decided, if we figure out how much phthalate exposure an average person would get in a day, we can show that it's, well below a threshold that would cause harm. So their margin of safety calculation was based on a single application of nail polish, a single use of hairspray, a single use of deodorant, and a single use of perfume over the course of a day. This obviously does not account for the exposure to salon workers, who would have much higher rates of application of these across the day. And we know that nail salon workers particularly have higher levels of phthalates in their blood at the end of a shift compared to the beginning of the shift. I mean, this data exists, but the CIR chose to ignore it as not being part of their scope. Again, with environmental hazards, nonylphenol was a good example. When they reviewed this a number of years ago, they realized that they had not established a kind of a blanket safe as used for this ingredient. They established a threshold level, which they decided was going to be safe in cosmetics. They realized that their threshold level was order of magnitude or two higher than the levels allowed in the European Union. So they sort of said, well, let's figure out why we have this discrepancy. Why are they so much stricter in the EU? And then they discovered that in the EU, the restriction was based on this premise that European water bodies were at risk because of the persistence of these chemicals and because of the potential to cause endocrine disruption in ecological species. So they said, well, great. The panel determined this is not an issue that's relevant for assessing consumer safety of non-oxynals. And so they decided, to go ahead with their threshold levels because they were able to ignore endocrine disruption and the persistence in water bodies as not relevant to their scope. Again, not serving the public health or environmental health in their decisions of safe as used. Okay. So the third failing is this overly broad conclusions on inhalation hazards, and I kind of love this one because it's just kind of insane. This one, inhalation is a very important pathway of exposure to cosmetics. If you've ever, you're looking at this picture, you're imagining what this woman is breathing in. To manage concerns of ingredients, they realized that they talk about inhalation a lot. They wanted to be consistent between their various assessments of different ingredients, and they do have a lot of ingredients that have data, whether it's epidemiological data or laboratory data, showing that they're respiratory irritants or that they're potential lung carcinogens or otherwise causing lung disease. So they came up with the idea of writing up some boilerplate language for how to deal with this. And what they based it on was their analysis of, a general scientific assumption that if a particle is large enough, basically if it's greater than 10 microns in diameter, it's not going to be inhaled deeply enough into your lungs to cause a health impact. It'll be sort of caught in the upper respiratory system. You'll be able to clear it out. It's not something that they have to worry about as a respiratory problem. So in their boilerplate, they used a single study that came out of Europe, which measured particle sizes in a number of different consumer products, two of which were cosmetic products. So here is the language that they came up with. They say the CIR expert panel noted that in practice, 95 to 99% of the droplets and particles released from sprays are greater than 10 microns, based on this one study of 2 products. Thus, most particles that are incidentally inhaled from cosmetics are going to be deposited in the upper respiratory tract. They're not going to be respirable to any appreciable amount. So every time they have a chemical that has some kind of inhalational hazard, they generally use this boilerplate saying, well, but 95 to 90% of the particles are going to be too big. We don't have to worry about it because they're not respirable to any appreciable amount. They use this language a lot. They actually use this language in the talc safety assessment, even though they make it clear that talc is not used in cosmetic sprays because it clogs up the nozzles. But they say in general, in practice, 95 to 99% of the particles are going to be larger than 10 microns, even though there's data in the safety assessment from the talc manufacturers that they actually mill it to smaller than 10 microns. So they know it's smaller than 10 microns, but then they're saying that it's larger. They don't have to worry about the respiratory hazard. So again, it's as if no cosmetic product is ever inhaled and causing a problem, which we know is simply not true. We've all had experience of inhaling a cosmetic product that is really unpleasant. And so it really avoids this major inhalation pathway that could be a concern for a number of ingredients. And then the last one we have is this inadequate assessment of data gaps. The reality is, for many cosmetic ingredients, there's just incomplete information out there in the literature. We just don't have studies of all the different, all the different endpoints that we'd like on all the different ingredients. But the absence of having data does not mean the absence of harm, and this is one that the CIR does not always take into consideration. So an example of this is the preservatives, the formaldehyde releasers. They've done these in relatively recent years, quaternium-15, the MDM hydantoin, and I'm going to call the last 2 DU and IU because they're too hard to pronounce. And I'm going to botch them if I try. So these are all preservatives. They release small amounts of formaldehyde. That's what helps kill the bacteria in a product. The problem, of course, is that formaldehyde is a known carcinogen. So it's logical to wonder if these formaldehyde releasers might, in fact, be carcinogens as well. Turns out no cancer studies have ever been done on any of these chemicals. Amazing as that sounds, there's nothing in literature where anyone's actually looked to see whether or not these chemicals could cause cancer. None of the CIR safety assessments actually mention cancer as an endpoint. The word cancer is not in any of these safety assessments. And there's no mention that that data gap even exists. It's like cancer does not exist when they're discussing the safety of these products. And they were all given, conclusions of safety by the CIR without discussing the fact that cancer is really a controversial issue with these formaldehyde releasers. So that's a problem. In more recent assessments, they have come up with a format that does do a lot better in getting at data gaps, but they don't always pay attention to it. So they actually have language in a lot of the more recent safety assessments that mention where data were not found. So this example is polymerized tetramethyl cyclotetrasiloxanes. Even the CIR is not exactly clear where these chemicals are used in cosmetics. No one, of course, has ever heard of them, and no one has ever researched them in there. So in the safety assessment, it claims that there's data on absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, acute toxicity, repeated dose toxicity, reproductive and development toxicity, genotoxicity, carcinogenicity, and dermal and ocular irritation of these chemicals were not found in the public literature, and no unpublished data were provided. So these are pretty much all the endpoints that they look at. I think they might have had one study on dermal sensitization. They had no data on these chemicals whatsoever. They were still able to give them a safe as used in cosmetics after deliberating on the lack of data, I suppose. So really, I think the public deserves a little bit more. I mean, they can ask industry to provide them with data. They didn't, right? They just let this go. I don't know what these chemicals do. No one really knows what they can do. And if they're harmful, but it seems like at least a little bit of data would have been a more responsible way to go with these chemicals. So those are our four major failings of the CIR, and like I said, there are so many more. But the bottom line is, if you're just relying on the CIR assessments to substantiate safety, this can lead manufacturers to use cosmetics which are in fact unsafe, whether for the planet or for our health. And we think this is happening today based on the safety assessments that have been published. So moving forward, we came up with these 5 key features of a safety substantiation process that would make it more authentic. We don't have a specific process in mind, but these are the features that we highly recommend. Transparency is important, both of the science and the process of how you make safety determinations. Assessment of impacts on the broad scope of both health and environmental outcomes, including cumulative impacts, is really important. Consideration of vulnerable populations have to be included, both workers, pregnant women, children, and others. An opportunity for public involvement, particularly if the government is doing safety substantiation, the public has to be involved in that deliberation and decision making. And then lastly, managing and really acknowledging where the data gaps and uncertainty in the science is, and then coming at that with a precautionary approach rather than an assumption that if there's no data that everything's just fine. So I will stop there. The full paper can be downloaded at our website at this link, and we've also got a fact sheet and a blog about it as well. So I will stop there.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. And if you do have questions, you can go ahead and type those into the chat box as we go. And at the end of Janet's presentation, we will, if you want to raise your hand, you can ask a question, or just read out the questions in the chat box. But Janet, if you wanted to unmute yourself and then double-click the slides as you move forward.
Okay, got it. All right, well, thank you, Alex, so much for that wonderful presentation, and thank you, Jamie, for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. This is such an incredibly important topic and dovetails nicely with what I'm about to discuss. So for those of you that do not know us, Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, formerly the Breast Cancer Fund, is the only national organization focused solely on preventing breast cancer by identifying and eliminating the environmental links to the disease. We coordinate the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics. It's a project of Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. Oh, I guess I have to see. Oh, it worked. Which is a coalition made up of 150 nonprofit organizations and over 1,000 safe cosmetics companies that are protecting the health of consumers, workers, and the environment through public education and engagement, corporate accountability and sustainability campaigns, and legislative advocacy designed to eliminate chemicals linked to cancer, birth defects, reproductive harm, neurotoxicity, etc., from the cosmetics and personal care products that we use every day. And just a few of our founding members include Women's Voices for the Earth, Clean Water Action, Environmental Working Group, Friends of the Earth, Healthcare Without Harm, and the National Black Environmental Justice Network. Since the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics launched in 2004, we've helped to move the cosmetics industry towards safer products and practices and stricter ingredient disclosure. And just a few of our hard-fought victories include getting the major nail polish manufacturers to stop using the toxic trio of formaldehyde, dibutyl phthalate, and toluene, convincing the world's biggest multinational cosmetics companies to globally reformulate to the EU stricter cosmetic safety standard, driving triclosan, DBP, and DEHP phthalates out of the mainstream cosmetics industry's use, working closely with Weave to secure historic voluntary fragrance disclosure policies on the part of Unilever and Procter & Gamble, and much more. But our end game has always been stricter federal oversight and regulation of the $84 billion cosmetics industry. And for over a decade, the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics has been working to secure passage of meaningful health-protective federal legislation to give the Food and Drug Administration the statutory authority it needs to ensure cosmetics and personal care products are safe for people and the planet. Most people assume that the FDA regulates cosmetics the same way that it does food and drugs to ensure that they are safe, when in reality, cosmetics are one of the least regulated consumer products on the market today. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, the FDCA, includes 112 pages of standards for food and drugs, with just a single page devoted to cosmetic safety. And what little law exists has only been amended once since it was enacted 80 years ago. As a result, cosmetic manufacturers can use practically any raw material to formulate a beauty or personal care product without FDA pre-market testing or review, even chemicals established by scientific authoritative bodies to cause cancer, birth defects, reproductive harm, and learning disabilities. The FDA does not have recall authority to remove dangerous products from store shelves, and labeling loopholes exempt the disclosure of fragrance ingredients and the labeling of professional salon products. Ironically, we are now finding ourselves in a be careful what you wish for situation, with cosmetic safety the flavor of the day for Congress, with legislators from both sides of the aisles authoring and advocating for federal cosmetic safety reform, and with a dark Tosca-like situation brewing where the big multinational cosmetics companies are using the promise of federal legislation to pacify the growing lack of consumer confidence in the safety of their products, while simultaneously demanding behind closed doors legislation that does nothing to change their 80-year-old self-regulation of cosmetic safety, but does give them the PR cover they need to assure their customer base that the problem has been taken care of. For a long time, the action was in the House of Representatives, where Representative Jan Schakowsky from Illinois and her then-House colleagues, Senator Tammy Baldwin and Ed Markey, were the only members of Congress calling for comprehensive federal cosmetic safety reform. They co-authored the Safe Cosmetics Act of 2009, 2011, and 2013, which was drafted largely by Jane Houlihan, who was then with the Environmental Working Group, and supported by the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics. Their bill set a high bar for cosmetic safety, banning CMR chemicals from cosmetics, putting consumer and worker safety first, and demanding cosmetic companies take responsibility for their supply chains and be accountable to the FDA and the public for the full disclosure and safety of their ingredients and their products. Then Representatives Dingell, Pallone, Lance, and Session worked their way into the conversation with the introduction of 3 different cosmetic safety bills in the House in 2012. But things stayed quiet in the Senate. That is until 2015, when Senators Dianne Feinstein from California and Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, introduced the Personal Care Products Safety Act of 2015. Over the past 3 years, the legislative landscape has changed even more dramatically as more and more cooks have entered the cosmetic safety kitchen. Since the introduction of the first Feinstein-Collins bill in 2015, we've been trying to convince the author and the Help Committee leadership, which has jurisdiction over this issue, to strengthen the bill to make it more consumer-facing, while also working to influence the introduction of a stronger companion bill in the House being drafted by Representatives Pallone and Lance. The Campaign for Safe Cosmetics has taken a support, if amended, position regarding the Feinstein-Collins legislation, advocating for common-sense strengthening amendments when or if the bill moves forward in the legislative process. But Senator Feinstein has remained surprisingly adamant that her bill was pre-negotiated with industry and that she risks losing their support if she strengthens it. Sorry, I'm just having a little problem. Oh, dang it. God. Sorry about this. Okay. Then in October, Senator Orrin Hatch, a Republican from Utah, introduced his own cosmetic safety bill, which is 10 pages long compared to the 100-page Feinstein-Collins bill. Until last fall, Senator Lamar Alexander, the chair of the Help Committee, was uninterested in moving Senator Feinstein's bill or even having the safe cosmetics discussion in his committee. This changed, however, when Senator Feinstein threatened to put a hold on all of the committee's FDA bills once they reached the Senate floor, unless Senator Alexander agreed to take up the safe cosmetics issue. Toward the end of 2017, the Ranking and Minority Committee staff working for Senators Alexander and Murray, respectively, decided to craft and circulate their own bill, which is now being referred to as the Alexander-Murray bill, pulling from both the Feinstein and the Hatch bills, and further weakened by low expectations of what the Republican majority would be willing to stomach. Similar to what we saw in TSCA reform, there is a lot of industry support for the Feinstein-Collins Personal Care Products Safety Act. It's pretty clear, at least to me, why the big industry giants are supporting the appearance of federal cosmetic safety reform. Some of the industry actors are more direct than others. In a January 2017 statement from Leslie Weststein, President and CEO of the Personal Care Products Council, entitled Reiterating Support for Cosmetic Reform Legislation in the 115th Congress, she states, the number one principle of federal cosmetic safety reform is to create a strong national program for the uniform FDA regulation of all cosmetics in the United States. The national regulatory program must preempt different or additional state and local laws that address cosmetic safety. As promised, in February, the Senate Health Committee circulated a cosmetic safety discussion draft for stakeholder feedback. The Campaign for Safe Cosmetics sent 2 sign-on letters signed by 120 safe cosmetics companies and NGOs to the Senate Health Committee leadership, laying out the core cosmetic safety legislative priorities we wanted to see incorporated into the new committee bill. Some of our key legislative priorities were incorporated, but most were not. For example, the discussion draft included a weak safety standard, which did not include a reasonable certainty of no harm. There was no definition of vulnerable populations to ensure a higher level of protection. There was no clear direction to cosmetic companies regarding their responsibilities to substantiate the safety of the cosmetic chemicals in their products. There was no prohibition of the CIR to be considered an authoritative body for purposes of assessing cosmetic safety. And there was no required ingredient labeling for professional salon products, required ingredient disclosure of web-based sales, no fragrance disclosure, no deadlines for FDA ingredient review, no funding mechanism, and no discussion of preemption, meaning that conversation was being held for a later point. The goal of the Help Committee was to have a revised discussion draft to be recirculated for feedback in early May. So they had a draft discussion draft. They sent it out for stakeholder feedback, and they were going to recirculate a new version in early May so that a bill could be introduced and be ready for markup by the Senate Help Committee in mid-May. This clearly did not happen. I am now hearing from committee staff that the Republican committee member opposition to many of the campaign's key legislative priorities, coupled with the industry support for full preemption on the state's ability to legislate on cosmetic safety, has caused the negotiations to come to a halt, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing given the current makeup of Congress and the anti-regulation Trump administration. In the best of all worlds, the Democrats would take back the Senate, which could give us a chance to make the Feinstein-Collins bill stronger in a new Congress. So I'm going to now shift quickly to the states to tell you what's going on there vis-a-vis cosmetic safety. Given the lack of federally mandated fragrance ingredient disclosure, consumers are looking to the states to fill that void. In response to interest from state advocates and legislators, BCPP drafted model state legislation to require fragrance ingredient disclosure for personal care products and cosmetics. In 2016, 3 states used this model bill to draft and introduce legislation requiring fragrance ingredient disclosure for cosmetic products sold in their state, and to build momentum for federally mandated fragrance ingredient disclosure. During the 2017 legislative session, Alaska, Minnesota, Mississippi, Montana, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island introduced fragrance disclosure bills. In 2018, the same states, with the exception of Montana and North Carolina, introduced fragrance disclosure bills. Although none of these bills passed, we consider these efforts a success because they raise public awareness about the problem a lack of fragrance ingredient disclosure exerts on public health. They amplify the right to know demands on the industry, and they build momentum for federally mandated fragrance ingredient disclosure. 2 California cosmetic safety policy initiatives are also...
I found this on the web for experts on public...
Sorry, that was Siri. 2 California cosmetic safety policy initiatives are also moving this year. BCPP teamed up with Women's Voices for the Earth, Black Women for Wellness, and the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative on California legislation to introduce California legislation that would require ingredients in professional salon products sold in the state to be disclosed on the product label. We also sponsored a budget stakeholder proposal to increase funding and support for the California Safe Cosmetics Program, a unique program that publishes a publicly accessible database of beauty and personal care products sold in the state containing Prop 65 carcinogens and reproductive toxicants. So what's next? With the passage of California cleaning product ingredient disclosure legislation last year that was co-sponsored by BCPP, and that was my timer. I just have 2 more slides. With the passage of cleaning product ingredient disclosure legislation last year, fragrance disclosure in cleaning products will now be regulated more strictly than fragrance disclosure in cosmetic products. 2 of the big multinationals that make both cleaning products and personal care products, Procter & Gamble and Unilever, have raised the bar for the rest of the cosmetics industry by adopting voluntary fragrance ingredient disclosure initiatives for both their cosmetics and their cleaning product portfolios. The market movement toward fragrance disclosure will tee up the introduction of legislation in California in 2019 requiring fragrance ingredient disclosure for any cosmetic or personal care products sold in the state to further align cosmetic fragrance disclosure with cleaning product fragrance ingredient disclosure. And because California is such a powerful driver of market change, we expect passage of this law will force fragrance ingredient disclosure throughout the state. So, what can you do politically? Many of you in the environmental health movement are very busy already with your own legislative advocacy priorities on equally pressing issues. However, I'd like to invite you to join our efforts to secure the most health-protective, meaningful cosmetic safety reform possible because the time is right now. And I promise we'll make it easy for you. And wouldn't it be nice to get a jump on industry this time around? So there's some additional resources here on my last slide. I invite you to contact me if you have questions and visit either of our websites for more information. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Janet. So we have a couple questions from folks. One is, I think you kind of answered this, but was from Chris. Oh, and I should just say, if you do have a question that you don't want to type into the chat box, you can also raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask it. So what is the status, timing of federal safe cosmetics legislation? I think you basically said in the Senate it's pretty much dead right now, right? Negotiations have stopped, so we don't expect that to move forward.
Well, the negotiations have stopped, but it's anyone's guess what's going to happen.
Okay.
And so I think the answer to that is we just don't know.
We don't know. Okay. And then, well, I think you answered the question, who is driving it, and what alternative is being considered to codifying the CIR as a regulatory authority?
Well, the alternative to that, which is something that we support, BCPP and WEAVE and our partners in the campaign, is that real scientific authoritative bodies be considered authoritative, like IARC, NTP, the EPA, et cetera. So those lists of hazard lists of chemicals that have been established by scientific authoritative bodies should be considered appropriate for use by cosmetic companies when establishing the safety of the ingredients that they're using, not the CIR.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Also, I had a question, Alex, when you were talking about CIR, how it doesn't take into consideration exposure to workers like salon workers. The CIR did find that formaldehyde in hair straighteners wasn't safe at any level. Is that right? And then was that just based on exposure then to clients, or was that based? Do you remember how they based that?
Yeah, it was definitely an unusual decision for the CIR. They did when they did recently review formaldehyde. It came up because of kind of the Brazilian blowout thing. They had previously said that formaldehyde at a certain level is safe in cosmetics, but they had established a level. But then they realized that these products that were heated and that were gassing off were a different story. It was definitely evident that there were none of the major players of the PCPC and none of the major manufacturers were making the products that had this concern. They weren't making those products. So they had certainly had more license. Exactly, they had more license to say that it was a problem. They didn't particularly talk about the workers. It was still more of a consumer impact, but they just sort of thought like, well, if all this formaldehyde is gassing off, you probably shouldn't be breathing that in, and so they were able to say that it was unsafe in products that were heated. But yeah, certainly an unusual. But they were certainly open to hearing from manufacturers if they could prove otherwise. And so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Jane, as well as the push from organizations like BCPP to require ingredient safety and disclosure. How can we create the pull from consumers to demand change? That's a really good question.
Do you wanna start, Jamie?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think the two go hand in hand. That's how our advocacy has always worked, by having market campaigns where you're engaging consumers or people to contact the companies and ask them to remove certain chemicals or require more disclosure. It definitely helps push companies too towards supporting legislation. Well, one, just doing it voluntarily, right? Because we know that legislation can take a really long time, especially on the federal level. But also, it can change their position on certain issues. We saw that with cleaning products, where we passed that bill in California, where we did get some fragrance disclosure and disclosure on labels. And that what really helped get companies to support that legislation was the fact that for years we'd had these market campaigns against them, and a lot of them had already started doing it, or they were hearing from their customers that this was something that they wanted.
Yeah, this is Alex. Just to add to that, I think getting consumers to call companies, whether you're calling the 1-800 line or whatever, is amazingly powerful. When they hear that feedback that their consumers care about the ingredients in their products and they want to make sure that they're safe, and they want the company to be substantiating that they're safe. That when they get calls saying, how come you've got parabens in your product? Why do you think parabens are okay for this product or whatever? They are listening to that, and they don't like getting those comments, and so and that drive a lot of voluntary behavior as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've always thought of this work as a three-legged stool, where the market-based campaigns and the state legislation raise consumer awareness and increase consumer demand for safer products. And that pressure that's exerted on the industry moves the industry toward voluntary initiatives to create the safer products, but also creates the demand and the pressure and the momentum for federal legislative change. And you really can't have one without the other, because it creates this real cacophony of noise and information about the issue that really starts to shift the market.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then the next question is, what's the status of the California Safe Cosmetics Program budget request?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I have good news as of today, and that is both the Senate and the Assembly budget subcommittees with jurisdiction over the California Safe Cosmetics Program have recommended an additional $1.5 million for the program next year in one-time funding to create a brand new electronic reporting system for the companies, and a brand new public-facing database that's more usable, more user-friendly, as well as an additional $500,000 in ongoing funding for the program to augment the $300,000 in funding that it already gets. So all of that means that going forward, the Safe Cosmetics Program will have close to $1 million in ongoing funding, and next year it will have an additional $1.5 million to spend on some necessary things. So that recommendation from both of the committees still has to be voted on by the full budget committees in the Senate and the Assembly, but because it's such a small amount compared to the $1 billion that they just spent on public health funding last week, we're really strongly optimistic that it will move forward.
That's great news.
Yeah, thanks.
And then there was a question, did federal cosmetics bills or draft bills prior to the Murray-Alexander bill also rely on CIR as an authoritative body? And the Feinstein bill did.
I think a lot of the bills that I've seen they describe,
yeah,
so generically, they don't say like, if you trust the CIR, that, if you go by the CIR's links, but they just describe if there's an independent body of experts that happens to be, reviewing cosmetic ingredients, of which the CIR is kind of the only one out there. So it doesn't necessarily, I don't know that they've, specifically named the CIR, but they've certainly described it in a way that the CIR would fit.
Hey, Jamie, can I just pop in and mention just another quick answer to that question about how do you get consumers interested in this issue and demanding safer products? And I did want to just make a shout out to the Savvy Women's Alliance that's run by Christy Marsh, that's organizing women across the country on many of the issues that Weave has been talking about over the last decade, and breast cancer prevention partners, but particularly around the safe cosmetics issue. So if anyone is interested in learning more, they can contact Christy Marsh.
Great, thanks, Janet. We only have a few minutes left, so if you have any more questions, type them in. Question about the House bill. So Schakowsky's going to be introducing something, and then Lance and Pallone.
So
what do we expect to happen in the House, if anything?
So thank you for asking that question. So Jan Schakowsky, who really has been our best champion on this issue for about a decade now, is planning on reintroducing her Safe Cosmetics Act. And the idea was that she would be doing so either this month or next month. So the short answer is very soon. And her bill is really the high bar for cosmetic safety. It is like the best of all worlds cosmetic safety bill. We also, and the reason she's introducing it is to try to raise the Pallone-Lance bill even higher, because Cologne and Lance, and they're a Democratic and a Republican congressman from New Jersey, are planning on introducing the companion bill to the Feinstein-Collins bill. And all along, they had said that it would be pretty similar to the Feinstein-Collins bill. We want it to be stronger. And with the introduction of Jan Schakowsky's bill, there'll be even more pressure for it to reach a higher bar of safety.
Great. Thanks, Janet. Are there any more questions? Okay, well, just to remind everyone, I will be sending out a link to the webinar so you can view it and listen to it as many times as you want. But thank you so much for attending, and when I send the follow-up email, I'll include Janet and Alex's email addresses in case you have any more questions for them. But thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. And thank you to our speakers and Alex, of course.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.